So this is going to be a bit of an oddball video for me, and it is going to get into the realm of things that might be considered almost religious or spiritual. I also hope that it's the last or one of the last things that I'm going to say about the actual legal fiasco with Michael Fuller and Marc Mohan. I was, as I mentioned in my last video about that, sort of trying to tie a bow on it. But I realized that in the last day or so there was a little bit more that I wanted to talk about. But I also want to plainly admit that what I'm talking about here is not stuff that I know for a fact. It is stuff that I suspect intuitively, and I've made a little bit of an intuitive leap to get to. And I've tried very hard most of the time to stick to the facts and what it is I actually know and can prove. There are a few times in the story that I have told things that were my own conjectures, and I've always tried to be very upfront about that, admitting when things were conjectures. But I also think I've said myself, and I think other people would probably agree, that my intuition has been very good a lot of the time about this stuff. And a lot of stuff that I didn't have the actual evidence to prove it at the time turned out to be very true later. It turned out that my intuition was absolutely right on. And I believe this is one of these cases. And what I'm telling you now is not something that I just intuited recently. It's actually something that I've intuited a long time ago and was, wondering about when the best time to speak up about it was. And I think that this is actually the right moment to mention it. So before I get into the specifics of it, it is going to be a little bit of messy detail about some of what happened in the court case. And I will try to give an overview of it in the video, but I'm going to try to keep that relatively brief, and I will put a more extensive timeline in the description of the video so that you can look over those details and see all of that, where this is coming from here. But I actually want to give a little preamble, a story that's not related to that, that just, in my mind, sort of hints at the type of almost religious or, spiritual thing I'm talking about here. In that, I've already told in a previous video about how Jennifer had told these lies in her follow-up statement on September 9th, 2022, about our story in Australia, and it happened to come just a few days after I had discovered this old love letter of hers in my filing cabinet, which is right over there, by the way, that basically completely contradicted a lot of what she said. And the fact that I happened to have come across that letter at just that time and just the right evidence to just show what a liar she was just ended up being this kind of crazy stroke of luck, or the hand of God, you might say, something like that. I don't know. It depends on how you feel about those things. But there's something else here, too, that I feel is sort of similar to that. I recently started making videos about instructional Scrabble material, and one of those was a really cool game I made against a player. I played against a player named Pot, who was one of the young leading Thai players who did very well at one of the recent international tournaments. And it was a really beautiful game, but in that game, which I gave some pretty cool commentary on, I'll link you to the video of that, I happened to be commenting, and there was one point where he played the word literary as a bingo, and he had higher scoring bingos at another place. And I tell you, this was no attempt by me. I saw that he had bingos at another place that were higher scoring, and the first one that jumped out to me was retiary, because it was kind of the most common word in that spot. But I happened, as I was making the video, to click not on retiary, but just the first recommendation that the Quackle engine had given in that spot that scored the same as retiary, which was the word terrify. So I wasn't even meaning to include the word terrify in that particular video. I just happened to click on it because it was the first suggestion in that scoring spot that scored the same as the play I was originally planning to show of retiary. And then the same thing happened a move or two later when I wanted to make the play Runcible, which was a play I had thought about earlier in the game, and the thing that the computer actually listed ahead of it as a suggestion was the word crucible. And if you think about it, these words, literary, I believe that what I've written on the blog is a very literary thing. I've been trying to make something of literary value, not just to preach for my case. And the people on the other side have been trying to paint me as a terrorist, saying about how I've terrified people. And terrify was a word the computer came up with in that spot. And then the first blog post was called The Crucible, and the computer came up with the word crucible in that spot. So this was not by my intention, but just somehow the tile gods wanted it to be, that in giving suggestions of these plays, that the word terrify and the word crucible showed up in my Scrabble commentary, which was just neutral commentary about the game. It wasn't meant to be commentary about my banning from Scrabble situation at all. And I reflected on this afterwards, and I thought, man, maybe I really should start believing in the tile gods. Maybe I should really start believing that things that seem like they're lucky or just happenstance, there is actually something else going on here. And what I'm going to share with you now, this story, is really maybe more of a numerological thing. There are two really important dates that stick out in terms of dates that several different things happened in my court cases and the history of them on June 8th and July 8th of several different years. Some of these things were seemingly unrelated events happening on the exact same June 8th, and some of them were related events happening on either June 8th or July 8th of different years. And this actually stretches out over about 4 different years here. So I just want you to pay attention to those particular dates, June 8th and July 8th. And I will tell you a little more that even though I'm not usually someone who's into numerology and all that, it is kind of a curious thing to me because I and my ex-wife and my son are all born on the 8th of a month. And I often joke that we were a bunch of crazy eights. Now, none of our birthdays are actually on either of those months, June or July, but it just happens that the number 8 in terms of dates is kind of an important one to me because of the fact that all 3 of our births were on the 8th of a month. So, just again, some weird sort of numerological coincidence, you want to say. But this June 8th and July 8th dates, keep those in mind. Now, this is one date that if you read over my blog, you would have actually seen in print a lot of times. I did talk about June 8th a number of times, particularly June 8th, 2023. And the reason I talked about it was because it was the particular day after NASPA was basically cock-blocking me and refusing to handle an appeal of my case, and I was trying to still get into the 2023 World Championship in Vegas that was happening in the next month, that June 8th, 2023 was the day I handed all my documents over to both Mina Lay, who was still on the WESPA board at that time, and Wayne Kelly, who was the head of the ABSP, the president of that, and the head of their board. So the exact reason I turned over those documents, and there was a letter accompanying that, which is plain to see on my blog, and I can send you another link to it in the description here, is because I wanted this to be no longer just a disciplinary case in which NASPA was involved, but in which both ABSP and WESPA were involved, so they could see and judge NASPA's own wrongdoing in handling this case. And it is particular, that date of June 8th, 2023, and that email that I sent them, that I actually copied Marc Mohan, who was still my lawyer at the time. This was about a month before his representation of me fell apart. So he got a copy of the zip file that was included in those emails that was all of the documents related to this that I assumed he was supposed to have already submitted for discovery. And it was not long after that, when I published The Scapegoat, that we ended up getting complaints from the other side, from Michael Fuller, that we had supposedly not handed in all the documents. And I later learned that was because Marc Mohan had failed to submit all of these documents for evidence, and he was completely confused about that, didn't even know what he had submitted and what he had not. And I even wrote other emails to Marc later telling him, go back and look at that June 8th, 2023 email, get all those files in that zip file, make sure you submitted all that to discovery. And I even told him the same thing by phone. And despite telling him both the same thing in writing an email and by phone, Marc was still so disorganized, so stupid, so incompetent, that the entire time he presented me, which went until late July, actually, so still another almost 2 months after that point, he never submitted a whole bunch of the documents that were in that particular zip file. But that was the last time, that June 8th, 2023, that I sent the zip file with all the documents to Marc that were supposed to be sent along as evidence, submitted as evidence for the case. Now keep in mind, the reason and the method by which Marc was supposed to submit all of these things as evidence were because of requests for production. Because the other side had submitted to him requests for production asking for all relevant documents to the case and all of that as part of the discovery process. And we had also submitted requests for production to the other side to try to get them to submit some documents. And of course, Marc was very bad about actually giving me copies of all these documents and even keeping me in the loop of what was going on. But he had submitted requests for production to the other side, and I managed to see all these documents later when I took over as my own lawyer and actually verified when everything happened. But part of what happened is that there had been this stipulated protective order, which of course was the means by which Michael Fuller was cheating in this case and doing a bunch of dirty, underhanded things to intimidate my lawyer. And he actually, Fuller and the Clinchys only ever responded to these requests for production one time. And the only response to request for production that they ever gave was actually on this same day of June 8th, 2023. This is just a complete coincidence. There's no connection between these events, but it happens that June 8th, 2023, the same date that I'm talking to both WESPA and ABSP, is the date when Michael Fuller actually deigned to respond to our side with responses to requests for production, but there was almost nothing substantial in those requests. Instead, what happened is he used this previous stipulated protective order, which had been approved in May by the judge, to claim that they didn't have to respond to these requests for production and hand anything in until 30 days from that point forward, because they were still busy labeling documents in terms of what should be protected under the protective order. So they basically managed to extend their deadline from June 8th, 2023 to July 8th, 2023. That is the exact date by which they actually were supposed to actually start producing some documents on their side, producing the relevant documents on their case that would come out in discovery. And keep in mind here, the timing of all this, June 8th to July 8th is actually a very important time in the history of my case. And some of this is explained in the particular blog post called The Smokescreen, what was happening around this time. It was this time at the end of June into early July that Ashley Vaughn, Lola's lawyer, started reaching out to us and giving us the idea that Lola was actually willing to possibly settle out of court, and that we started drafting up documents. I drafted up a particular statement for her to make. And I do believe that if Lola had dropped out of the case at that point, if we were going to settle out of court and she'd actually given a written statement walking back her statements, not only would the Clinchys be left as the only defendants in the case, they would have been in much worse shape, because they would have basically been dealing with more evidence showing that she was even admitting she lied, and then it would be clear that they told additional lies that piled on top of her lies. So this could have been absolutely disastrous for the Clinchys from a legal point of view if Lola and I had settled out of court. All right. But also, I talk about in this story how on the weekend of July 4th, the week of July 4th, which was early in the week that year, I was really sick, and I was really kind of out of it, not communicating with anyone, lost my voice for a while, wasn't really able to celebrate the holiday that fun way. I think actually I was on the Oregon coast, but I was so sick, I ended up staying in my hotel room and not even going to the fireworks. But what ended up happening was, it was July 6th, 2023. So this is only 2 days before that deadline that the Clinchys and Mr. Fuller were supposed to respond to the requests for production and actually start producing some paperwork, some documents themselves that were relevant to the case. That early that morning, Terry Kang reached out to me over Facebook Messenger telling me I should drop my case in a very rude way. And Terry and I had not had any communication for like over a year before that, since before this was a case. It was just an out-of-the-blue type thing. I believe and have strongly suspected for a long time. Terry, by the way, is also a lawyer. And it could be that she was being a dirty lawyer into these people, but I don't necessarily assume that. I assume that it's entirely possible she didn't even really understand the significance of what she was doing, and that she was played by the Clinchys and by Michael Fuller in some way. But I believe it is no coincidence that Terry Kang happened to reach out to me at that exact date, July 6th, 2023, literally 2 days before this July 8th deadline, where the Clinchys and Mr. Fuller were going to have to start actually producing some documents for requests for production. And started saying these things, and then immediately that same day, July 6th, after she did this, and I just gave her 2 quick Facebook messages basically telling her to buzz off, fuck off, I'm not going to drop my case, that same day, Michael Fuller designated that particular letter from Terry Kang under the protective order. And guess what? That was the only document that Michael Fuller ever designated under the protective order. Don't you think that if he responds to these requests of production on June 8th and saying, hey, we've got now a deadline of July 8th to respond to all this stuff, that they would have been designated a whole bunch of other documents under the protective order in that month in between then? But no. Only 2 days before, it's a document, but only one document under the protective order. And the exact document that it is the document of Terry's nasty lying email to the Clinchys that is trying to undermine and claim what is in my blog is false. And then Michael Fuller takes that letter and gives it to my lawyer, Marc Mohan, with a completely cockamamie story that I'm committing witness tampering in some way. When I didn't even reach out to Terry, she reached out to me, and I just sent her like 2 quick messages just saying, fuck off, leave me alone. But this scared Marc Mohan enough that on July 7th, still 1 day before the deadline, where they had to start responding to discovery and actually producing some documents, that Marc Mohan had threatened to withdraw from my case. And it wasn't just that he threatened to withdraw from my case on July 7th and emailed me this stuff. He went back and wrote, I found out later from some of Michael Fuller's documents, on that same day of July 7th, before he and I even got on the phone with each other, Marc Mohan emailed both the other lawyers, both Michael Fuller and Ashley Vaughn, who was Lola's lawyer, telling them that he was going to drop my case. So think about just how horribly unfucking professional this is. He hadn't even had a conversation with me first. He's just assuming the lies the lawyer on the other side are telling. And I know, Michael Fuller, you're going to make fun of me for my hand gestures. Okay, I'll try to calm down about that. But guess what? He bought hook, line, and sinker this con. He threatened to withdraw from my case on July 7th. I was so sick as a dog, I couldn't even talk on the phone to him. I frantically called him. When I talked on the phone, I was like hoarse as hell and he could barely hear me. But I just convinced him, like, don't do anything until the following Monday. And, like, by Monday, if I have my voice back, let's actually just meet in person and talk about this stuff. And I did get him to hold off on actually dropping the case. And it was actually over that weekend that I was able to sort out this must have been about the Terry stuff, which he wasn't willing to tell me. And that's the crazy thing, is because this document was under the protective order, as we've turned out only, Mark believed he couldn't tell me anything, even that Terry Kang was the person who wrote this letter, or what the supposed reason why he had to drop my case was. And even though you might say the actual letter that Michael Fuller delivered to him on July 6th was not covered under the protective order, only the attached letter from Terry was, he still didn't even let me see that letter. He didn't let me see what Michael Fuller had actually written in the July 6th letter. And he didn't even tell me that it was Michael Fuller who was actually pulling some strings and making him think that he had to drop my case. I intuited that. I figured it had to be the actions of Michael Fuller. But this is how just absolutely obscure he was being. He was saying, I have to drop your case. You should drop your case. You committed witness tampering, possibly, blah, 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 blah. I would be under an ethics violation to do this. By the way, I can't even tell you what particular lawyer contacted me. I can't even tell you particular reasons why. I can't tell you anything about what it is you supposedly did and why you have to drop this case. The whole thing just smelled of complete bullshit to me. But anyway, I managed to do detective work and figure this out myself, and eventually uncover that 3-message conversation with Terry and email it back to him before we finally actually talked the following Monday. And I basically got him to admit that I was right, even though he still didn't show me the letter that was marked for return test only, that my intuition was right about that this was about this little conversation with Terry, and he saw the ways he had been conned. He saw and believed me at that point. I told him, I talked to another lawyer over the weekend, a friend of mine, and he said the idea that this is witness tampering is absolutely absurd. And he realized he had just been absolutely duped by Michael Fuller at that point. But my point in all of this is this was a very intentional tactic. It was very intentionally timed to get just ahead of that July 8th deadline so that Michael Fuller could get my lawyer off the case, get me scrambling to find a new lawyer, get me figuring out how to do this, and get him completely mentally checked out so that we would never follow up and deal with the fact that they would just let this July 8th deadline blow by and never respond to these requests for production. And that's what happened over the entire next month of July. Now keep in mind, Marc Mohan didn't actually drop my case at this point. He was threatening to drop my case, and he went to help me find another lawyer, but it wasn't until about 3 weeks after that, so close to the end of July, that he was officially no longer my lawyer. But he was essentially mentally checked out at that point. And all he ever did over the rest of the month of July was just postpone hearings, hoping that a new lawyer was going to take over and attend those hearings for him, and just work on trying to find another lawyer to help me out. And he wasn't doing anything else in terms of actual legal service to me in my case, in terms of filing paperwork or answering things. Also on that July 7th, 1 day before that July 8th deadline, Michael Fuller actually submitted additional requests for admission that were claimed to be from Evan's Clinchys, that were actually delving into specifics of things that I talked about in that conversation with Terry Kang, trying to actually paint that I committed witness tampering and get me to admit that. Now, it was absurd. It was something like I was never going to admit that I committed witness tampering with a complete distortion of details, but I think part of the reason he did that is he figured that it was going to be a time of chaos for me and my lawyer, where my lawyer was dropping the case, and that this might just slip through the cracks, and I might not respond to it. And it turns out that the regulations on these requests for admission are that if you do not respond within 30 days on your side, the other side can take that as an admission. Can take it as you admitted that you did these things. So if he sends me a request for admission on that July 7th deadline, and it's the same day my lawyer is threatening to leave, and then the chaos of things falling apart with my lawyer and me finding a new lawyer, if I manage not to respond to that by 30 days later, by the beginning of August, then guess what? They can say he admitted that he committed witness tampering because he didn't respond to this request for admission. As it turned out, when I took over as my own lawyer and looked over all these documents, I did submit that request for admission response in time. I did deny everything, but I only got it in the first week of August. It was only actually a few days before that 30-day deadline, because there was a lot for me to ramp up on in terms of getting the computer account, seeing into all these files, and catching up on what the heck has happened. So I would say that he didn't quite succeed, but actually Michael Fuller came pretty close to succeeding in playing this kind of technicality card to try to get me to make a quote-unquote admission by omission that there had been some witness tampering here, which of course there wasn't. So anyway, the funny thing about this is part of what happened is as this chaos of this new lawyer taking over happened, or eventually him dropping out and me taking over a pro se, it was actually August 1st and 2nd of 2023 that both Ashley Vaughn, Lola's lawyer, and Michael Fuller filed their motions to strike the case down on the anti-SLAPP motions. And as is commonly the case here, when you have motions like this that have a hearing that is necessary to follow up, they emailed the court staff. And the rules on this is that all of the legal staff on both sides of the case get emailed in addition to the court clerks. So I was in on, since I was at this point my own lawyer pro se, I was in on this email chain and saw these messages. But between August 1st and 2nd, we scheduled this court hearing, and right at the end of that email chain on August 2nd, 2023, what Michael Fuller said is, discovery is now stayed pending the resolution of the special motion to strike under ORS 31.1522. So let's see what Michael Fuller did here. He intentionally created a huge amount of chaos in the case just before this July 8th deadline, when he was supposed to be responding to requests for production and actually producing some documents. And he actually managed to get away with never producing a single document in request for production because he just blew by that July 8th deadline and just blithely ignored it. And neither I or my lawyer had our shit together enough to actually follow up on that and to actually take any kind of complaint to the court that he wasn't obeying the rules of discovery, because we were too busy trying to find me another lawyer or find a way for me to represent myself. And then, as soon as I get to the situation of being able to represent myself and actually am starting to file documents right at the beginning of August, he immediately says, guess what? We're filing this now, and now discovery is on hold, so we don't have to answer any of your discovery questions. So basically, he's sort of making himself immune to saying they don't have to even respond to these requests for production. And it was only a few days after that that I was digging into this and figured out a whole bunch of the details of what Michael Fuller's and Jennifer Clinchys' wrongdoings were and the ways they were using bad faith litigation conduct. And I described some of this in the next blog post called The Smoke Screen, how I started filing requests for admission, trying to show that they were actually disobeying shit and doing stuff that was very dirty in order to lie to the courts or fool the courts or create these false stories, and being very disingenuous in how they were handling this stuff. A lot of bad faith litigation conduct on their part, while they were hypocritically criticizing me of bad faith litigation conduct when there was none. But of course, as soon as I did this, Michael Fuller argued to me that I was out of order even in submitting these discovery requests, because he had already, in his mind, put discovery now on stay because of the need to resolve the special motion to strike. So it's all about using technicality of the court so that they can keep pestering me with all of these requests for admission, inspection, information, all this type of stuff for production, and then just, hammer my lawyer so he never has time to actually do any discovery at his side to dig up the documents, and then create chaos in my case, get my lawyer to run away from the case, and then when I actually start trying to do the opposite and start digging into the details of the documents they have to share with me, oh wait, we don't have to share anything with you because right now there's a stay on discovery. So that's the exact trick they were pulling. But anyway, the funny thing about that is it ended up working. We never had any more discovery, and then we had the hearing in August and the whole thing got thrown out. But it was the case that I complained about the money award, and I think the judge later kind of figured out that she was fooled and was in a legal trap where she didn't really have a way to get out of making the money award to the other side. And at the same time, I was in such bad shape mentally. I was so checked out with my PTSD and just at home screaming alone by myself and just not having a lawyer or having any support that I couldn't make any progress on this, so I couldn't even appeal these decisions against me. But it actually took until 1 year later, in fact, it was exactly 1 year later, July 8th, 2024. So 1 year to the day after they were supposed to have started responding to these requests for production to give all these documents in, was the day that I was actually scheduled to come into the court to answer questions for a debtor's exam, to talk about my own finances, to reveal, what money Michael Fuller could try to take away from me or what assets Michael Fuller could try to take away from me in order to collect on this really unethical debt that I owed of attorney's fees. And of course, what I ended up doing is that morning of July 8th, 2024, I ambushed Michael Fuller. Before I went to court, literally like in the hour before I went to court in the morning, is when I posted that new blog post called The Millstone. And what I did in that blog post was I unveiled all of the documents of the ethics complaints against both Michael Fuller and Marc Mohan, made all of those documents public to the world by putting them on my blog. Not only did I make all those documents public to the world, but that was also the day, as I mentioned in the blog post, that I switched off the robots.txt exception in my blog. So now the blog could be searched by Google and other search engines, which meant that if people were just searching for Marc Mohan or Michael Fuller and stuff like that, a whole bunch of the documents of my court case of the ethics complaint against them were going to actually show up in Google searches. So I'm saying this lawyer has been really fucking dirty. He's trying to get me held in contempt of court now. He wasn't trying to get me held in contempt of court yet. That came out later. But he's trying to squeeze money out of me for this horrible decision. And guess what? I'm just going to go fully public with all this shit, and I'm going to refuse to abide by answering these questions about my finances. And I was public about it. I literally publicly in that blog post made that statement about here's what I'm going to say in court and why I'm going to refuse to answer these questions, even though I know it could possibly put me in contempt of court. And that was the day, July 8th, 2024, 1 year to the day after that funny deadline that Michael Fuller did everything he could to avoid having to meet, that happened. And I look back at this, and that's when things really escalated. And I do feel that Michael Fuller was so stupid in actually taking me to court for, contempt. It actually totally backfired in his face, because at that point, the Oregon State Bar was dragging their feet and not responding to the case against him for the ethics complaints. And it was because of the way I started writing in the documents of the case for contempt of court about how the Oregon State Bar was dragging their feet on this, that they finally deigned to start handling this. And I feel like somebody in the legal system started putting pressure on them, like, why haven't you addressed this particular thing? So Michael Fuller ended up getting no money out of me by going after contempt of court. He didn't get me held in contempt of court. All he did was draw more attention to the ethics complaint against him and actually get the Oregon State Bar to stop dragging their feet a little bit. It completely backfired in his face. But anyway, that's where we were, and I just wanted to tell this whole story and tell people I really, really strongly suspect that it was an intentional move by Fuller and or the Clinchys to get Terry to make this message to me on Facebook and to try to spin it in this false way, very intentionally at that time, so that they could avoid meeting that July 8th, 2023 deadline for requests for production. So they wouldn't have to actually hand in any documents in discovery. And they managed to pull it off. But the funny thing about this is I am telling this entire story to you now on July 8th, 2026. And when I started looking into this today and just looking up these dates and trying to find a way to unpeel and tell this whole story, it didn't even occur to me until I was, about a half an hour into it or so. I looked up at the calendar at the top of my computer screen. Holy shit, today is also July 8th. It's literally 2 years to the day after that day that I humiliated Michael Fuller in the court with this Millstone particular document. And part of what was funny about that is Michael Fuller didn't even show up to that court hearing. It may have been that he was never going to go in the first place, but there's part of me that suspects he was actually planning to come to court that morning to actually be the one to give me the debtor's exam, but that it upset him so fucking much when I suddenly spilled all the details of the ethics complaint against him and suddenly made my blog totally publicly searchable, that he was in too bad a mental frame to actually show up and face me in court, and that's why he had one of his other lawyers from his firm show up in his stead. So 2 years after that point, July 8th, 2026, is when I'm putting this whole story out there. And again, I don't know if you believe in mysticism and all that kind of stuff, but the fact that this July 8th and June 8th dates are so important for several different things in the case, and that they came up several years apart, that it was 1 year to the day after this failed deadline, that was the day I had to appear in court, and that I ended up humiliating Michael Fuller in this way, and it was 2 years after that I'm making this video now. It just kind of boggles my mind, and it gets me thinking, what is it about the number 8 and these dates on the 8th of a month? Hope you enjoyed the story.